The streets of Doha erupted after Qatar won its bid to host one of the biggest sporting events in the world, the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Here was a tiny country with just one major stadium and scorching heat, becoming the first in the Middle East to host the Cup. The oil-rich nation has reportedly spent over $229 billion preparing for the tournament. That's more than 16 times what Russia said it spent on the 2018 World Cup. But behind the glitz and celebrity endorsements lie accusations of corruption and human rights abuses.
Fans don't want to sit in a stadium that workers died to build. It takes the joy and the love that they have for soccer and tramples on it.
Manju Devi's husband was one of thousands who lost their lives building the venues. So what's the true cost of having a small desert nation host the World Cup?
The winner is Qatar.
Today we celebrate, but tomorrow the work begins.
Qatar had just 12 years to complete the largest infrastructure project in World Cup history. The Gulf state had to build 8 state-of-the-art stadiums, install new roads and rail lines, and expand its airport, not to mention But to make all this happen, Qatar needed a vast labour force. Migrant workers were behind its skyscrapers, resorts, and man-made islands, but this was on another scale. Qatar recruited hundreds of thousands of workers, mainly from India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, through agencies in their home countries. Just to secure a job, migrants had little choice but to pay recruitment fees of up to $4,000 before they left the country. And once they got to Qatar, they were already in debt and trapped in a system known in the Middle East as kafala.
The kafala system can be a form of modern-day slavery, and the features of it amount in some cases to forced labor.
It meant workers' visas were sponsored by an employer who had complete control not only over their job, but also their immigration status. Laxman Kamati shares a similar story.
50 केजी 60 केजी बोरीमा रमल कसेर यो टाउकोमा लिएर माथि जाने ऊपर जाने.
A chronic back injury from his time in Qatar prevents him from working today.
तल बैठेपछि उठ्न सक्दैन, खडा पनि हुन सक्दैन, तर लिएर खटाउने काम करायो, पैसा पनि दिएन.
Sometimes workers weren't paid for months. Those working on the Khalifa Stadium in 2016 were only making roughly 800 Qatari riyals a month or $220. At the time, Qatar didn't even have a set minimum wage. But it was still more than most could make in their home countries, so they kept coming. Employers provided workers with accommodation that was often cramped, dirty and unsafe. Myrul Khatun says her husband Mohammed expected to clean houses in Qatar. But when he got there, his sponsor gave him a construction job instead.
Hi sir, कहे बोल गर्मी बढ़ लगी, बढ़ धूप ने बेलचा चलबे, बोल हमरा मंगा ले, तो हमको मदिर के वही कहियो, घरे भेजा देते.
But Mohammed never came home. He was one of hundreds of migrant workers who died by suicide.
तो ताक लगली 4 दिन तक लगे तब भेटली सर. आवे वाला ये रहे नहीं.
Qatar said it got rid of the kafala system in 2016, but human rights groups say it never really went away.
Even since reforms were brought in 2016, 2017, and 2018, we've still documented some of the hallmarks of the kafala system. And this includes passport confiscation, wage cheating, cracking down on workers who try to strike about wage non-payment or poor working conditions.
Only in 2017 did Qatar prohibit work during the hottest hours over the summer months. But outside of that window, the heat could still be intense enough to trigger heart-related illness and even death. The Guardian found that there were over 6,500 migrant worker deaths between 2010 and 2020. But Qatari authorities registered 70% of them as natural deaths from sudden and unexplained heart or respiratory failure. Under pressure from human rights organisations, Qatar shut down more than 300 labour sites in 2019 and set new guidelines around heat stress. A year later, workers were granted the freedom to leave the country without an exit permit and change jobs without their employer's consent. but some families who lost loved ones were left without compensation. In October 2022, FIFA said Qatar had made real, tangible progress in addressing labour rights issues. Organisers made the inevitable decision to push the opening of the World Cup to the cooler month of November back in 2015, although the average temperature can still reach as high as 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The move was very disruptive to football leagues, especially in Europe, but many players are now perhaps more concerned about the reports of violations of migrant workers' rights in Qatar. Meanwhile, the host nation has worked hard to polish its image. Qatar is paying David Beckham $277 million to serve as an ambassador for the 2022 World Cup. Promotional videos paint Qatar as the perfect tourist destination, and they seem to be working. The tournament's chief organiser said there's been a record-breaking demand for tickets. Qatar expects to make as much as $17 billion in revenue from the World Cup. But a big question is, how will a country that's nearly 200 times smaller than Saudi Arabia accommodate all these spectators? Today, Qatari tourism estimates it has about 30,000 regular hotel rooms, but 80% of those have been booked by FIFA for official guests. As alternatives, Qatar has leased 2 cruise ships that can fit just under 10,000 people, called on homeowners to rent their properties to fans, and coordinated shuttle flights so visitors can stay in neighbouring countries. Tourists are also being offered tents in the desert. But for LGBTQ fans, the main concern isn't where to stay in Qatar, but whether or not they will even be safe there at all.
We do not stop anybody from coming to Doha with any different backgrounds, any different belief. Qatar is a very welcoming country.
Qatari law tells a different story. Homosexuality is still illegal and punishable by prison. Some hotels have said they will refuse accommodation for same-sex couples.
There are many elements of the World Cup preparations that people criticise about Qatar, and we're often with a lot of justification. But the one which I think is very unfair is the suggestion that Qatar somehow is a country that doesn't understand or doesn't like football.
And if one of the biggest sporting competitions on earth is to go ahead, human rights organisations at least want it to serve as a lesson.
The idea is there should never again be a World Cup that is so rife with human rights abuses, and that the beautiful game of football should never be associated with migrant worker deaths.
And accommodation for over 1 million spectators.